All right. Welcome to another episode of the Attorney Lounge. I want to thank a special guest today, Arizona Supreme Court Justice Kathryn King.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to join you.
Yeah, it's really a privilege. I appreciate you coming on the show. You are the first judge that we've had on the show, so it makes me a little nervous to interview a Supreme Court justice or a judge of any kind. Like, it's a little bit different for me. I'm a corporate lawyer, so I'm not used to being in front of judges. So this is something new for me.
Well, it really is. It's fun to be here, and I do think it's important for judges to be out there in the community and speaking to people, and because I think there's a lot of mystery about the work that judges do. So I actually, when you asked me about this, I thought this was a great opportunity to kind of clear up any mystery about what judges do and different pathways, at least my pathway to the bench. And every judge obviously has their own unique pathway, but thank you again for the invitation.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. I'm always kind of interested when I see Supreme Court justices for the United States, like doing interviews, and it's always a little surprising to me too, because you think, like, I tend to think of judges going back to their chambers and then being out of sight, out of mind. It's almost like when you're a kid and you go to school and you think your teacher doesn't have a life outside of the classroom. Like, you only know them as that teacher. Judges are sort of the same to me. I only think of them as like judges, and then they must not have any life outside of it. So it's really cool. And I want to kind of break down some of that mystery here and just have you take us into the life of a Supreme Court justice and what that's like. And so I want to get to that point. I think, though, we usually start the show off with a little bit of your background. I want to point out one thing, too. You do spell your name correctly, in my opinion. My daughter's middle name is Kathryn, named after her aunt, and it's spelled exactly the same way with a Y. So I love the spelling of your of your name.
It is a little bit unique, but yes, I always, when I'm telling people Katherine, but that's Ryn, I have to make that clear when I'm giving people my name.
And I also, we talked a little bit. You said it's okay if I call you Kate. So if I do that, I'm trying to not be disrespectful in terms of speaking to your honor.
No, please call me Kate. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, let's start out just a little bit. Like, tell us about your background, where you grew up, kind of went to school, and how you became interested just in law in the first place.
Yeah, so I was born and raised actually close to downtown Phoenix in Arizona. So I'm a native Arizona and born and raised, but spent time up in northern Arizona in Pine Top as a child. I had family in Tucson, my grandparents in particular. So I spent a lot of time traveling throughout the state as a child. I attended an all-girls high school, Xavier College Prep, where I was there for 4 years, and then I left and went to Duke University for undergrad. I was a political science major, history minor, just sort of interested in our system of government. And then I attended law school at the University of Arizona. So I went to Tucson and spent 3 years in Tucson. My interest in the law really was admittedly developed. My dad was a lawyer, but he, like you, was a transactional lawyer, so a corporate lawyer. He was not one in the classroom or in the courtroom, excuse me. But he, the law and our system of government was something that we talked about just in my household growing up. And he really kind of gave me this passion for the law and our American system of government. And I think that just sort of was slowly built in, into my childhood growing up. We would talk about it at the dinner table. We would have conversations and debates about, different policies that would help improve our system. So he had a love for the law, and he kind of gave that to me. I mean, I remember as a kid, he would take me to his law firm, and he would walk around and introduce me to his colleagues. He would also make a point of introducing me to his, female partners, and kind of show me, you can, look, Kate, look at these tremendous women leaders who are also mothers. And because I always kind of knew I wanted to grow up and have a family at some point. So there was this balance that I wanted to strike, in my future. And I think my dad recognized that and encouraged me, that, you can have both. You can have a career and you can have a family. And it takes a lot of work, and quite frankly, it takes a village of support. But so that's kind of a little bit of my background.
I'm disappointed to hear that you went to Duke. As a Kansas Jayhawk, that just hurts, were you a big Dookie? Like, were you a Cameron crazy or into sports at all? Did you go to the games?
Yeah, I did. So my dad actually went to Duke Law School. So when we were growing up, Duke basketball, again, part of our household. I have two older brothers, and they went to Duke undergrad as well. So we were all big Duke basketball fans and Coach K fans. And so it was sort of, I didn't really know where I wanted to go to college. I did look at other schools but I had visited Duke, and I loved the blend of the academics as well as the sports. And so when I got in, I thought that this is where I'm going to go. And yes, the basketball games were a ton of fun. And I was there for a national championship when we beat University of Arizona for the national championship. Yeah.
When Grand Canyon played, I was the general counsel of Grand Canyon. We played a game at Duke. So Jerry Colangelo, who's very involved with GCU, is very close with Coach K, and so they arranged the game. So I got to go over there and watch the game. We got to sit behind the bench and kind of do the whole thing. And I was really surprised how small it was. Cameron, when I was at the game. On TV, it looks like this just massive facility with just tens of thousands of people. And I know it's big, but it's not as big, I guess, as I imagined it. And it was interesting to me, too, when we walked out at halftime. It was like a little concession stand that you might see like at a high school game or something. It was just it was one of those things like going to Wrigley Field or like any of these iconic places. It's like what it was in my mind was very different than what it was in person. It was an amazing experience. We got blown out, by the way, but it was still a lot of fun. Really cool. Did you do the whole camping thing? I've heard like stories about how that all works. Did you do that?
I did not. I did not end up doing that. I kind of worked my way. I was an RA for 1 year, a resident advisor. So I got entered into a drawing, and so I fortunately got a ticket to a Duke UNC game in Cameron Indoor Stadium. So I guess I had other ways of getting, and then as a student, had the opportunity to go to games. So that was fun, but I did not camp, admittedly.
Got it. So while you're at Duke, then it's interesting to me too. Did you know that you wanted to come back to Arizona? Part of the reason I ask, I've counseled some students at Grand Canyon who were interested in going to law school, and a couple of the students that I've talked with, they had opportunities to go to other firms, but they ultimately knew they wanted to practice in Arizona. So they ended up choosing U of A, ASU, to go to law school because they kind of wanted to be back here. Was that similar for you in terms of choosing Arizona, or were you thinking about other law schools?
Well, I was thinking about other law schools. I actually thought that I wanted to explore other parts of the country. I thought it would be fun to maybe go to law school in Washington, D.C. and or maybe New York, other parts of the country. But for me, reality set in. I had undergrad student loans. So at the end of the day, we have two tremendous law schools in Arizona, ASU and U of A. I would qualify for in-state tuition. And I knew I wanted to end up here in Arizona. I knew I wanted to practice law in Arizona. So my heart was just telling me to return to Arizona. I got a great legal education at a fraction of the cost had I gone to other law schools, in other parts of the country. And so and I think that's top of mind for a lot of law students right now is just the legal or the debt that comes with getting a graduate degree of any nature, including a law degree. So so I returned to Arizona, and then my family's all here, so it made sense for me to come home, and really my heart is here in Arizona.
Yeah, I love it. That was a similar discussion that I had with the student that I'm thinking of at GCU, where he had an opportunity to go to Georgetown, but he was like, man, I'm going to end up with so much debt versus coming to school here. He ended up going to U of A, and he got a great education, and he's worked at DLA Piper, and now he's at Gibson Dunn and some of the biggest firms in the country, and a wonderful education at a fraction of the cost, and he ended up where he wanted to be. And for me, I went to school at the University of Kansas, in-state tuition, and same thing. I mean, to me, a lot of it is kind of what you do when you're in law school, the opportunities you take advantage of, and the networking you do. And you may have a bigger network and maybe an alumni base that's in more substantial positions at some of those bigger schools, but the opportunities are there regardless of the school that you choose. And so I always think that that's a good way to approach it.
Yes, and you never know where your law school classmates are going to end up, and I'm sure the same is true with you. I mean, it is remarkable, kind of looking back as to where people have landed. I mean, some people are no longer practicing law; they're on the business side of things. Some are in-house counsel. Some are in elected positions in government. It really is. There's just it really is your relationships in law school do matter. I mean, your relationships, if you're interested in a career in the law, those relationships matter. But it is the law school connections that you make will carry with you through your career.
Yeah, it's each of these stages of my life as I've gone through these different experiences. You kind of have I played baseball out of in my first 2 years of college, and that experience was a new one, and we were all coming from somewhere else, and we went through that together, and you kind of form this bond. And then, going to law school where it's the same thing. Everybody's kind of coming in together, and it's this unique new experience. And so you kind of, and then coming to Snell, when I started at Snell, same thing. Everybody's like, what is this all about? And those new unique experiences you have are kind of bonding experiences that form for the rest of your life. And I think the other thing too that I took advantage of, like the summer internships that I did, and I did a clerkship my third year with a district court judge in Kansas City, and I just I try to encourage my daughters to take advantage of those opportunities, because they're not going to be there for the rest of your life. You get this small little window, so take advantage of those opportunities as you're going through. Did you when you were in law school, I think I saw you clerked maybe or was that after law school when you clerked?
I did. Well, so like you, I actually spent a summer with a district court judge here in the District of Arizona, Judge Carroll. And then, yes, after law school, I clerked for Justice Ryan on the Arizona Supreme Court. And in fact, two of the current justices on the Arizona Supreme Court are former clerks of this very court. So me and Justice Lopez as well as a former law clerk of the court. So yeah, that was a tremendous experience and really eye-opening as to, what the judicial branch does and its function within our system, again, within our system of government and within the separation of powers, the three branches.
At what point in this journey for you did you start to think about being a judge or Supreme Court justice? Did that sort of start to formulate in your mind when you were doing those clerkships, or is that something that came much later?
Much later. Yeah. I when I was clerking here, I had no idea that I would end up working or being a member of this court. I think, honestly, my career, I actually worked in all three branches of government throughout the course of my legal career. But I also spent most of my years practicing law in private law practice. But what ended up happening was I just, I was doing my job, doing my work, and then one opportunity kind of led to another door was opened, and then lo and behold, many years later, I sit back and I look back and look at, I had worked in all three branches of government. I was also served in another constitutional body of Arizona state government, the Arizona Board of Regents. I was a regent as well. So I had served in these positions, and just over time, and I will say I did not think about becoming a judge or a justice. What it took was somebody one day saying to me, gosh, you're so passionate about Arizona's judiciary and our merit selection system for how judges are appointed in Arizona. I think you'd make a great judge. Have you considered applying? And that kind of planted that seed that eventually grew over time. And so it was really a long process for me to think about becoming a judge, also because there are different kinds of judges. You know, I stopped to think about, well, would I want to be a trial court judge or an appellate court judge? So yeah, for me, it was a long process and not something I necessarily had planned in law school or even immediately after law school.
Did you practice so I guess maybe we could talk a little bit about sort of after law school, what your career was like in private practice, and curious whether you had a lot of exposure in the courtroom. Like for me, I always joked, like, if I don't even know where the courthouse is. The only time I've been to a court is when I got selected for jury selection or whatever, you know, like as a corporate lawyer, I don't know anything about it. So my practice is not involved, been in the courtroom at all. What was your private practice like? Did you have exposure to the courtroom? And I guess kind of walk us through kind of sort of before this, kind of what your practice was like.
Yeah, so I did, as mentioned, I clerked for the Arizona Supreme Court. And then I started my practice at Snell and Wilmer, which is a full service law firm, and I had an opportunity to be exposed to kind of different practice areas there. Ultimately settled in the labor and employment practice group there, which was litigation, but also advice and counseling. And we would also work with transactional lawyers that were, you know, needed help reviewing documents, transactional documents that contain components of the workforce, right? So you need a review from a labor and employment lawyer. You know, the labor and employment practice area involves, you know, there's components of business litigation and employment claims, traditional employment claims, administrative charges, investigations. So it was a wide variety of things. But yeah, so you combine my work after Snell and Wilmer, I went to the governor's office, and I was deputy general counsel in the governor's office for about 3 years. And then I returned to private practice for about 4 years. And so yes, throughout my career in private practice, it was a lot of litigation, a lot of drafting of motions and you know, summary judgment motions, taking depositions, arguing those motions in court, evidentiary hearings. So it was that traditional litigation practice. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, honestly, my favorite thing to do was to sit down and take a complicated legal claim and try to distill it down for a judge to understand in the clearest way possible while still getting across your substantive legal points and doing that in kind of an organized fashion. So I just always loved legal writing, and that was you know, a lot of the work that I did as a practicing lawyer.
Yeah, employment law is always kind of interesting to me because you do kind of have both ends of it. Like as a corporate lawyer, we were always pulling in employment lawyers. I mean, you know, here's a GC. I'm working with an employment lawyer in Canada at the time, you know, because we're working on employment agreements, and we acquired a business in Canada, and we're trying to get some of the documentation in order, you know, because Canadian law is very different than the U.S. And so there's that transactional side of the practice. But at the same time, those attorneys in the labor and employment group, you know, at Snell would be in the courtroom as well, or taking depositions. And so, like you said, too, doing a investigation, you know. So there's so many different hats that you can wear in that practice area. How did you land in labor and employment? I landed in the corporate group because of my summer associate year at Snell, and I really hit it off with a lot of the corporate attorneys and kind of opened my eyes to what that practice would be like. Was that the same for you? Was it your summer associate year, or was there some other reason that you ended up in employment?
Yeah, summer associate period of time, I worked with some of the employment lawyers. And then my first year as a practicing lawyer at Snell and Wilmer, I just slowly started finding myself doing more and more projects for the labor and employment lawyers. It was sort of a gradual transition. And then at the end of that year, back then at that time, you made a decision about which practice area to join. And I had decided that was the practice area I wanted to join. One of the things, too, that I really enjoyed about the employment law area is that you have to obviously know the law. You're giving advice, you're writing you're making legal arguments to a judge. When you get a phone call from a client, they need advice in real time, and you have to take into consideration the law, of course, but you also have to know, okay, you have to know their industry and their workforce, because the advice you give to a company that has 20 employees may be different than an advice that you give to an international Fortune 100 company, just based on, the practicalities of the situation. So I really enjoyed connecting with people in that way, and also connecting with witnesses, whether that was taking a deposition, defending a deposition, doing an investigation. I mean, if you're doing an investigation, you sit down with the person, you have to make them feel comfortable, and connect with them in a way that they feel like they can be, forthcoming and honest with you. Because as part of the investigation, that's what you're trying to do, is to get the facts and get the information. So I enjoyed the practice area for a lot of reasons, but that is one component of employment area that you get that you may not get with other practice areas.
Yeah, I mean, it's very personal. That area of law is always interesting to me because, I mean, you're dealing with the juiciest stuff, if you will. It's like you kind of see anything and everything, and I always try to do that as well. I try to be as personable as possible. Like, if I don't have all the information, I can't help you. So you like, help me help you. It's a little bit of the Jerry Maguire thing. And so you're trying to make people comfortable. You're trying to get the information you need so you can make the best decision. And I always kind of say too, like, people aren't talking to lawyers, for fun. Usually it's one of the toughest things that they're going through in their career. And so you're having to kind of help them navigate something. It can be very personal, very emotional. It's kind of different than the corporate area, or, tax, or some other, practice areas. Employment can be kind of a very personal sort of practice, I guess, if you will. And it's your bedside manner, I guess, as much as the legal practice, understanding the law can make or break kind of your success in that area. So.
Yeah, and interesting too, as a judge, just as you were talking, it makes me think too. I mean, as a judge, I recognize too, and I think most judges do recognize that, yes, we have a lot of different cases that we're working on at any given time, but when that person walks into the courtroom, that is the most important thing that they have going on in their lives at that moment. They are there for really significant reasons, significant challenges, whether it's an eviction proceeding, or a business that they opened and are operating, but somebody misappropriated their trade secrets that they spent so much time developing, or whether it's a family dispute, whether the judge is making a decision about who's going to have custody of the children, and those kinds of significant matters. So I do think, in some ways, my previous work in law practice is a reflection of, now I know, when people are coming into the courtroom, that is, like I said, the most important thing that they have going on in their lives at that moment. And it's important to them. And as judges, I think we do, we do recognize that is important, and they need to be heard and listened to, and have a fair shake, and have their arguments, listen to those arguments, take all of the facts and evidence into consideration, and the legal claims, and then make a decision. But yeah, I think that's an important component of what we do as judges, is making sure that parties feel heard.
Yeah. You're getting a fair opportunity to make your argument. And it's interesting to me too. I mean, having never been in your shoes, it's, you have to be empathetic towards people, but at the same time, the law is the law, and that it can be difficult probably sometimes to make decisions when you still have empathy for the person that maybe you're ruling against, but you have to make. And that's where I think, like, you were kind of talking about thinking through issues very logically, always is interesting to me. I think the brightest people in the world to me are the people that can take complicated subject matter and boil it down and make it very understandable to anybody, even if you're not an expert in that subject area. I had a professor at KU, Stephen McAllister, who was a constitutional law professor. He clerked at the Supreme Court. And I was just always amazed at how well he could take these, we would read these constitutional law cases and opinions, and you'd be like, man, I can't make sense of any of this. And he would break it down in a very logical way and make it very understandable. And so I can see how, like, you're talking about like that in your private practice and how that translates to your world today. I'm always fascinated with people that can do that. And I can see you go even all the way back to taking the LSAT. I mean, the LSAT is like a big logic exam. And so I can see how that translates to your current role today, for sure. One question I had too before we leave kind of private practice, I've kind of asked some other guests about this, is sort of the difference between working at a bigger firm like a Snell and a small firm. Was it Burns Barton? Is that kind of where you worked at separately? Talk a little bit about the differences between a big firm and a small firm and what you kind of didn't like, pros and cons of those two different practices.
So at a big full service firm, you have the opportunity to, obviously you have your practice area, but you're working with people as you talked about earlier. You may be a transactional lawyer, but as an employment lawyer, you're pulled in to help them with their transactional work. So you really have an opportunity, you have your clients, and as a new lawyer, I was trying to develop my own clients and develop those relationships outside of the firm that would hopefully bring in my own client base. But a large component of the relationships that matter too are your internal relationships at the firm, because if you are doing good work for the transactional lawyers or the healthcare lawyers or other practice areas that need your assistance, then you're going to be referred work from your other colleagues, which is a benefit of a full service firm, is that it's a source of work that you get in that way. I ended up so I worked in the governor's office for 3 years, and then had an opportunity to go to a smaller firm, Burns Barton, and I can't remember, about 8 lawyers at the time, 8 or 9 lawyers when I was there. So it was really nice, and it's a labor and employment boutique firm, so it did not have that aspect of having a full service firm. So if I had a client call me with an IP need, an intellectual property need, I couldn't refer it to the IP lawyer at Snell and Wilmer. I would have to, at the time, refer it to another firm, and I, necessarily wouldn't get revenue credit for that kind of thing. So that's a difference with being at a smaller firm. But on the other hand, I really at a smaller firm, I wanted to be a partner, but I didn't want to bill 2,000 hours a year, because I have 2 young kids, and I just knew, and my husband is a practicing lawyer, and I just knew it would be too much for our family. And so I wanted to bill, I didn't want to bill half-time, didn't want to be 2,000 hours a year, but I wanted, for me, that kind of sweet spot was 1,500, 1,600 hours a year. Being at a smaller firm, there was that flexibility that allowed me to be a partner, to bill kind of that range of hours that worked well for me, given my family situation at the time. But also do very sophisticated work with clients of all sizes, and representing individuals in employment matters as well. With reviewing employment agreements, or giving them advice about a non-compete in agreement and how to negotiate all of that. So I was able to, and my hourly rate was lower, so I was able more accessible to clients who maybe couldn't pay the full, the larger rates that come with bigger firms. So there definitely are kind of pros and cons to both approaches. But at that time in my life, that worked well for me.
Yeah, I think for students, there can be a lot of sort of bashing that occurs of big law firms and stuff, but I think if you have the opportunity to begin your practice in a big firm, it's a great way to launch your career. There's so many resources available, access to different partners, different practice groups. Like you say, the kind of the focus on education within the firm. I think it's a great way to begin your practice. And then, the small firms, boutique firms, they have their own sort of pros as well. But I think, starting at Snell myself, I just really thought that was a good way to launch my career and kind of get started and get my feet wet. Coming out of law school, I think the first thing I realized when I got to Snell was how little I knew about the practice of law. So it was nice to have some other attorneys that could kind of go, all right, you're a little knucklehead. Like, I'm going to bring you along and teach you how this works. So that helped me a ton. What was the experience like working with Governor Ducey and working in that branch of government? Just talk a little bit about what that practice was like.
So there were two lawyers in the governor's office at the time, and if you think about it, it is the executive branch of government. The governor's office has its own group of employees, but the governor appoints the directors of all the executive agencies in the state. So the Arizona Department of Corrections, the Arizona Department of Administration, Arizona Department of Health Services, and Department of Transportation, and so on. So it covered so many different types of issues that would come up. I was, as one of two lawyers in the governor's office, we handled litigation involving the governor's office and the state of Arizona. But we worked on clemencies, so executive clemencies, pardons and sentence commutations. We worked on the appointment of judges through our merit selection process. The way it works in Arizona is that there's a commission for the four most populated counties in Arizona, and then all appellate court judges. In order to become a judge within those categories, you apply to this public commission that's made up of actually primarily non-lawyers, just members of the public. And then you apply to that commission, and then they interview you, and then they send a list of names to the governor. And so the governor gets a list of names and is on a 60-day clock to appoint a judge to fill a vacancy. And so my colleague, the general counsel, and I, we spent a lot of time on the vetting and advising the governor on the appointment of judges. That was a lot of time that we spent in that area. But there would also be questions that would come, I'd have people within the office come to me with questions about, public records, questions about, a piece of legislation that may be in, working its way through the Arizona House of Representatives or Arizona Senate, and would it be subject to legal challenges, and what is the likelihood of those legal challenges prevailing? So it really was day to day. You never knew what was going to come up. And that is what made it honestly really interesting. And you're moving quickly, and you've got to learn things quickly. And so day to day, it was just a variety of different things that would come forward.
Yeah. Transitioning to your current role, how did that come up, I guess, initially? And then what was that process like in terms of being vetted for this position?
As I mentioned earlier, I spent quite a bit of time, thinking about, okay, well, do I want to become a judge? And then thinking about, okay, I do want to apply to be a judge at some point, but would that be trial court or appellate court? And just kind of thinking through what the best position for me. And ultimately, I settled on appellate court in an appellate court position. And actually, my plan was to apply for the Court of Appeals. There were going to be some openings on the Court of Appeals, some retirements coming soon. So I got my application and got the application. It's actually, interestingly, it's the same application, or at least it was then, for the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. So I just periodically would start filling it out. And I had made the decision, okay, there's going to be a Court of Appeals opening. I'm pretty sure I'm going to apply for that opening. And then suddenly what ended up happening was there was an opening on the Arizona Supreme Court. And because I had been out there telling people, oh, I'm planning to apply for the Court of Appeals, I had, a number of people reach out to me and said, there's going to be this opening on the Supreme Court. Why don't you apply for that position? And including judges reached out to me, and I thought, well, yeah, I am going to apply. But that, that was a long process for me to consider as well. So fortunately, I have a really supportive husband, and, we kind of worked through that process together, but I ended up deciding to apply for the Supreme Court. It is a very robust process. As I mentioned earlier, you apply to the Commission on Appellate Court Appointments here in Arizona, and every state is different. In some states, there are contested elections. So it's one candidate versus another on the ballot. The way our process works is through the merit selection system. That Sandra Day O'Connor, it was her, really, she was the one who launched it in the state of Arizona, and it's been in place since the mid-'70s. And you apply to this Commission on Appellate Court Appointments, a very robust application with writing samples and references and all of that. And then the commission vets the candidates. They decide who to interview. So I went in for an interview. It's a public interview. During that interview, it's a public meeting, so anybody can be there. And so there were a lot of members from the public there at that meeting. And then the commission votes on a list of names to send to the governor. And so the governor's office then receives a list of names, and then kind of the process starts over. They receive the application, but then I was subject to 2 rounds of interviews there, a staff interview and then an interview with the governor. And so it's a very robust process from start to finish. And it takes some time. It was kind of a lengthy process. But it's part of what makes our merit selection system, I think, so fantastic. And we really do have a great judiciary in Arizona.
That's interesting. So do you remember where you were when you got the call? How did you find out you'd been selected?
Yeah, I was in my office. I don't remember what day, but it was a work day, and I was in my office, and I received that phone call, and my heart was pounding, and it was really, really exciting, and really honestly, the honor of a lifetime.
Yeah, what an honor. That's amazing. And I'm sure it was exciting, not just for you, but your entire family. And so once you're selected, then what happens at that point? I guess just practically speaking, I mean, I guess you got to you were working at Snell at the time?
I was working at Burns Barton at the time. But yes, you have to wrap up your practice. So I did have, I had an effective date. I don't know if it was a month later or something. So that gave me time to appropriately transition my cases and file notices with the court, withdrawing from cases and making sure that all of that was handled appropriately. But also, tying up loose ends. I mean, I remember one case, I was the one who was kind of taking charge of one specific issue we were dealing with. And so I had to make sure that I got everything down and updated for my colleagues. Okay, this is where everything stands right now, and here's what needs to be done next. So it's wrapping up a law practice. And then, of course, coming over to the court and making sure you have to hire your judicial assistant, hire law clerks, make sure, I mean, as I mentioned, my husband's a practicing lawyer, so you have to make sure I have all my conflicts, all of that kind of squared away to make sure that I've got all the logistics set up to operate a chambers. And then you hit the ground running. The first month I was duty justice, so every month on our court we have one justice who's duty justice, who's in charge of where there's kind of expedited issues that come up or motions filed with the court and a decision needs to be made. There's one duty justice who takes charge of that and gets out gets out the orders on those. And so, yeah, so I was duty justice my very first month. That was a great way, though, to kind of dive in and just get started on all the different legal issues that are coming before the court.
You just go right into the deep end of the pool and start. Did you, as you transitioned, with the Supreme Court justice that you replaced, did you take that person's staff, or did you come in and start with a whole new staff that you hired? How did you go about that?
Yeah, so when I came in, his law clerks, it was actually just that transition time where law clerks were rotating out. And so his law clerks, she was technically in my office for, I think, a week or two, but she was transitioning off into another position. And so and Justice Gould's JA, I think moved on, found another position. So I had to hire 2 law clerks and a JA immediately. That was actually my first item on my to-do list, in particular to hire a JA.
And how, again, kind of this behind the scenes, like how does that work, your chambers, and from a practical standpoint, how many clerks do you have? Like how many people on your staff, and what types of things do they do to help support you in this role?
I have 2 law clerks and then a JA who are my staff. I also often have externs who are the current law students, and they either summer or one of the semesters, and they are here as well. My law clerks function, and the extern to some degree when they're here, predominantly when we accept a case for review, I have my law clerks. So one of them will take the case, they will review all the briefing, review the factual and procedural background, review all the legal issues before the court, and they prepare a bench memorandum that summarizes, okay, here's the history of the case, here's the facts, here are the legal issues, because by the time it gets to us, it's really narrow focus on the legal issues before us. And they make recommendations. I ask them to. I say, I really want you to, here's the legal issue, I want you to review it on your own. And we talk about it, of course, but make a recommendation of how you think the legal analysis will work here and how the case should come out. And then we sit down and talk about it before and after the oral argument of the case. But, I really want them to get exposed to that skill of thinking on their own and, developing their own legal analytical skills. And of course, sometimes I disagree with those opinions, but I think those with their decisions or recommendations, but that's part of the skill of becoming a lawyer. And then let's talk about it and where, what are some other things to consider. So it's a constant process that we're doing in chambers with the law clerks, and it is really a wonderful opportunity. I mean, if anybody's interested in being a law clerk, I recommend them looking at that.
I mean, truly an amazing experience. I remember when I was doing kind of my clerkship, if you will, my third year. It wasn't like a post-law school clerkship, but I was like a student clerk. And I got to sit in the chambers with the judge and his law clerks, and we would kick ideas around and talk about cases. And I just remember what a cool opportunity that was for me to kind of see the behind the scenes and to have those discussions. And I just think, for the clerks in your office, it's got to be a truly amazing experience to kind of like kick these ideas around and debate them. And I had another attorney on the show, Shan McGam, who clerked at the U.S. Supreme Court, and he talked about the experience of sitting with the justices and getting to know them and debate these legal issues. And I just think it would be an amazing experience. What do you look for when you're looking at vetting clerks and hiring clerks? What type of experience, qualities are you looking for when you're hiring?
Yeah, well, it really is. I mean, obviously somebody who, I don't look for a particular GPA, but I think somebody who has performed well and demonstrated their efforts and their diligence in law school, with not only performing well in the classroom, but also, taking advantage of other opportunities in law school that I think Law Journal or Law Review is really beneficial for the work that we do at the court. Just even things like site checking and being very detail oriented about commas and you have the opportunity to edit documents, and that is really valuable for the work that we do here at the court. But in addition to that, somebody who, I value references. So those are really valuable because that gives me the insight into who this person is in the real world. Are they an ethical, upstanding human being? Because at the court, it is really important that we are upholding the impartiality and integrity of the court. And my law clerks are a reflection of me. And so I need to make sure that the people that I'm bringing in, reflect those standards. And so I'm also looking at them, and we do an interview as well. And that gives me an opportunity to get to know them, not only their legal analytical thought, their skills and their thought processes in answering those questions, but also get to know them personally as well. So I enjoy that process as well. So it's kind of an entirety of a lot of different factors that come into play.
So from a different angle, what advice do you have for lawyers practicing before the court? What things do you see that you don't like? What things do you appreciate? Both in the brief writing process and in oral argument. Kind of what's your advice for lawyers practicing before the Supreme Court?
Yeah, well, I think one thing too is, and this is kind of going back to when we're reading briefs and you're citing some piece of evidence that's in the record or some transcript or something. Be sure that your citations are correct. I think another thing too is ensuring that when you're citing a case, ensuring that you're citing it accurately. So there can be situations where there's a description of a case and a holding of a case, but you go to the actual case and it's like, well, that's actually not what that case stands for. And I think you end up losing credibility with the court when you do things like that. And that goes a long way too. So those are a few practice pointers.
What about, oral argument? I was taught in law school that, oral argument's almost kind of perfunctory. It's just sort of something you do, but the decisions are all made on the briefs. How much how much do you rely on oral argument? And I'm sure it probably changes from case to case, but what is that part of the process like for you? Are you someone that asks questions from the bench? Do you just kind of listen, or kind of how do you approach oral argument, and what kind of weight do you put on that as part of the process?
Well, I really actually value oral argument more now than I did necessarily thinking. I had that same thought as a practicing lawyer. Well, how valuable is oral argument? It actually can be very valuable in a lot of ways. And to that point, every time I'm writing an opinion, I actually go listen to the oral argument, because sometimes within those oral arguments, there are arguments made that I need to address in the opinion, or there's a concession made in the oral argument that helps tighten up my legal analysis in the opinion. So, and it's really valuable to get clarification. The cases before our court are so difficult. We are a court of discretionary review for the most part. There's some election cases and capital cases that we have to take, but for the most part, we're deciding which cases to take because they're difficult cases. And so I actually find oral argument really valuable because it helps us, okay, here's your argument. Well, what's your best authority for that argument? Cite me the case that you think best stands for the point that you're trying to make. And so I find that oral argument really valuable in clarifying and also I think it helps make our legal opinions better and more sound.
I always heard too that don't take anything from the questions that are asked. because sometimes the judge or the justice may be asking a question. They may agree with you, but they're trying to address the counter arguments, and they need help with those. So they're asking you, and so it may appear that they're kind of opposed to you, but they're really not. They're really just trying to sort of help, flush out kind of the weak spots of the case. Is that accurate?
Yeah, sometimes there are softball questions that we just kind of want to get your argument, your best argument on the record on that point. Or sometimes a judge or a justice may ask a question because they're trying to convince their colleagues. They want to get the argument from you because they're trying to convince their colleagues that they think that your argument wins the day. So there are all sorts of reasons that questions are asked at oral argument. But ultimately, I think, at least at the Arizona Supreme Court, we are not only writing the case, the opinion for that case before us, but we're writing it for future cases in the future. So we often need to know where do we draw the line here, not only for this case, but we have to try to foresee, we're looking at cases that may come in the future. So sometimes we're asking questions just to make sure that we're getting the law right, not only for the case before us, but for future cases as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we're kind of hitting the 1 hour mark here, so I'll kind of wrap up like I do on most of these, which is, what advice do you have for aspiring law students or law students thinking about their career and what they want to do? Like, how do you counsel students interested in law as a career for things that they should be thinking about, how they should approach, whether they want a career in law, if they want a career in law, what practice area they should be in, like what types of things would you advise them on?
Yeah, so I do think networking is a great way to figure out if a particular practice area or the practice of law in general is going to be beneficial for you. So just talking to people, what do they like and don't like about their practice areas? And I think, going out to coffee and just meeting with people is really valuable. I think what will happen too is that, if you do good work, if you are, a good colleague, your work product is excellent, you're a diligent worker, I think what's going to happen is you're going to have new opportunities that you didn't even expect come your way. And be open for those opportunities. So the timing may not seem perfect. You may not have expected to be, have this new opportunity come up with an in-house position or with a government position, and you're feeling a little bit nervous because you don't know everything about that industry or all the functions of that government. But be open to those opportunities because, quite frankly, the people who are asking you to come be a part of their team, they know you don't know everything about everything, but they know you're, kind of a good worker, a good person, and you can learn and be open for learning opportunities. And so, just don't necessarily dismiss an opportunity that comes along because you feel like maybe you're not fully ready for that position. Be open to those opportunities because it will just continue to open up new doors along the way for you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's, take advantage of those opportunities. They come along, and the consistent theme I've heard from you kind of throughout too is credibility. At a young age, you start to build a record of your credibility as a person. Even if you're working in a restaurant, you're working in, as a clerk, you're working as a young attorney, credibility and your, anybody that hires you is going to be hiring you. You're going to be a reflection of that person as well. And so think about whatever you do, the impact that you're making on other people and the credibility that you're building throughout your career as you kind of move along, I think, is also, has come through as a theme, I think, in this discussion, which I think is important.
Well, thank you, Brian. This was great.
No, I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for taking the time to do this. I want to briefly just make a pitch to the audience. If you like the show, please like and subscribe on YouTube or Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I want to thank Array for sponsoring the show and making this possible. Justice King, Kate, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be here today.